Welcome back. Joining me now for a debate on whether the time has come to curb the powers of the Rajya Sabha is JDU MP Pavan Verma, Akali Dal MP Naresh Gujral, Congress MP and spokesperson Abhishek Manu Singhvi, BJP spokesperson Sambit Patra, and the former Secretary General of the Lok Sabha, PDT Achari. Sambit Patra, yesterday speaking in Bombay, the Finance Minister for the second time this year called for a debate to question to what extent the indirectly elected upper house can hold up reform or other legislation passed by the directly elected lower house, which he says represents the will of the people. Now, I want to ask you a simple question. Is this a reflection of the Finance Minister's frustration because GST and land acquisition amendments are stalled in the Rajya Sabha, or does he have good grounds for demanding such a debate?
No, definitely there are good grounds, but I would say even if Mr. Arun Jaitley was frustrated because of the fact that GST and the land bill were not passed, it is quite genuine a cause in the sense that the frustration would be quite, anyone who's sane mind would be frustrated looking at what was happening in the parliament this time. If Mr. Jaitley or any minister of this government is frustrated with the fact that GST could not be passed, the frustration I would call as genuine because of the very fact that GST is not a personal demand for the Bharatiya Janata Party or the government. It is for the country.
Okay.
If GST adds 1.5 to 2% of to the GDP, it's but natural that GST should see the light of the day. But because of political reasons, when such important bills as GST and the land bills are stalled on the upper house, definitely it's the reason of worry. And that's the reason as to why Mr. Arun Jaitley, an astute politician and a well-read man, in fact, has kept this view.
Pavan Verma, the Finance Minister compared the Indian Rajya Sabha to the British upper house, the House of Lords, where progressively in the last century, curbs have been placed on the House of Lords' capacity to either veto or delay legislation. But the question I want to ask you is this: how apt is the comparison between our Rajya Sabha and their House of Lords? After all, the House of Lords is unelected, and secondly, it operates on the hereditary or the appointment principle. The Rajya Sabha, on the other hand, is indirectly elected, and additionally, the Rajya Sabha represents the states in our federal system. So is that, in your eyes, an apt comparison?
I don't believe it's an apt comparison, Karan. Article 79 of the Constitution says that Parliament consists of the President and the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha. The makers of our Constitution gave very careful thought in the Constituent Assembly about the powers of the upper chamber or the Council of States, as it was later called. And it created a system of checks and balances, which I believe broadly has stood the test of time. For instance, as an example, I will say to you that money bills can only be introduced in the Lok Sabha. The Rajya Sabha does not have powers as an indirectly elected house to stall or amend a money bill beyond debating it for 14 days, and it can only recommend amendments to it. But there are other balances also, that a constitutional amendment must be passed by a majority in both houses. So careful, I'm just giving one example, I can give many more. The Rajya Sabha was created in order to prevent hasty legislation and allow a parallel house which represents the will of the states as part of a federal polity to apply its mind to the efficacy of such laws and perhaps and most in all cases improve upon it. That is the purpose for it, and I can give you one example.
No, don't give me more examples.
In the 2 sessions prior to this one, 48 bills were passed by the Rajya Sabha.
Absolutely, but we are not talking about how many bills are passed, we are talking about this different issue. Is the comparison between the House of Lords and the Rajya Sabha apt or not? And you've answered that you believe it's not apt. I want to pursue that a little bit with you, Mr. Chari. To begin with, the first critical question is, can the power of the Rajya Sabha to either delay or veto legislation be amended without damaging the federal nature of our Constitution, wherein the Rajya Sabha represents the states in a way in which the Lok Sabha does not?
See, I am a little baffled by this talk about curtailing the powers of the Rajya Sabha because of a certain situation which has arisen in Parliament. See, the Parliament consists of the President and the 2 houses as per our Constitution. And the powers and the role of Rajya Sabha have been laid down and described in the Constitution very clearly. Of course, it is true that so far as the money bills are concerned,
But we're not talking about money bills here, so leave that aside.
well, curtailing the power of the Rajya Sabha. Now, for what? For what purpose? Is it because there is a perceived block of legislations in the Rajya Sabha?
Yes, the
I
answer
think-
is yes.
I think it is very unrealistic to talk about legislations being blocked by the Rajya Sabha, because the Constitution of India is very clear. If the Rajya Sabha rejects a bill which has been passed by the Lok Sabha and transmitted to it, and if there is a disagreement on a particular amendment between the two houses, then I will just complete
I'll
it.
come to joint sessions in a moment time, sir. But I want to ask you a specific question before that. I want to ask you this. Given that the Rajya Sabha is designed to represent the states and does so in our federal system in a way in which the Lok Sabha does not, if in that situation you were to put curbs and restraints on how long the Rajya Sabha can hold up a bill, would that damage the federal nature of our constitution?
No, that certainly, if you curb the powers of the Rajya Sabha, certainly that will affect the federal character of the Indian.
So, in your eyes, inherent in Mr. Jaitley's proposal, and it is only a proposal, is a clause or a concept that would damage the federal nature of our constitution?
Well, I do not know under what circumstances he has made this proposition, but looking at the issue as it is, I would say that there is no, and it is not justified to curb the powers of the Rajya Sabha.
Okay. Abhishek Singhvi, I want to put a different aspect of the Arun Jaitley proposal to you. Can the power of the Rajya Sabha be amended without damaging the key role an upper house plays in a bicameral parliament to check the lower house or to balance the lower house, particularly when the lower house has a majority belonging to one party?
I have many other things to say, but to first answer your question, it's a very good question, because my view is that although untested till now, a abolition or a severe curtailment of the upper house, which de facto makes it impotent or very weak, would possibly violate the basic structure of the Indian Constitution itself. Obviously untested, because nobody has tried it. It is surprising as somebody put it, a well-read person like Mr. Jaitley can make so superficial a suggestion. It would require a whole-scale amendment to the Constitution. A Constitution can't be tinkered with. It's a holistic, integrated structure. You can't tinker and say, just like money bills exception is there, we'll add exception A, B and C again. There is a holistic spirit to the whole thing, and without a constitutional amendment for which there appears to be absolutely no consensus, it's not even a starter or even a talker. More than that, England is a particularly inapt example because it's the most unitary of countries. Kenneth Weir, a famous writer in Australia, said that it's wrong to call us based on the English Constitution. We are federal or quasi-federal. We are not unitary at all like England. And one more thing, Karan, is it not a little opportunistic and hypocritical that these great grand ideas did not strike them when they were in the opposition?
Well, great grand
they
ideas
disrupted,
usually strike when there's a
when
need.
more time was lost than by one
reform
disruption.
happens when there's a
Is
need.
that not
The
opportunistic?
opportunism is inherent in the requirement.
No, the point is, no, but this abolition or reduction of the powers of Rajya Sabha, Karan, is not a GST specific issue.
Okay,
It's not a law specific issue.
quite right.
We are extrapolating from an individual case to a structural change, which is completely wrong.
I take your point, and therefore what you're really saying is don't jump to conclusions
And
just because of
I
one
also
particular
find it
instance. Let me bring in Naresh Gujral at that point. Naresh Gujral, I accept, as you've just heard Abhishek Singhvi point out, that reform of the Rajya Sabha for now is ruled out simply because it's a constitutional amendment. Neither the BJP nor the NDA have the members to push through a constitutional amendment that requires a two-thirds vote, which you simply don't have in the Rajya Sabha. But what about accepting some conventions that apply in Britain? Conventions are different to reforms. For instance, Britain has a Salisbury Convention which ensures that bills which are part of the election manifesto of a government are passed by the upper house even when the government doesn't have a majority there. Now that would apply to this situation, but it could apply to any other situation in reverse when Congress were to come to power 5 years down the road. Do you think we need our equivalent of the Salisbury Convention in India?
Karan, first of all, I totally agree with Mr. Jaitley that the Rajya Sabha cannot hijack the economic reform policies of the government of the day. They have the mandate of the people, they came with certain promises, and they must be allowed to respect those policies, those promises. As far as the Rajya Sabha is concerned, the framers of our constitution very wisely gave some powers to the Rajya Sabha, so that if the members of the Rajya Sabha felt that Lok Sabha members had acted in haste, then they could look at it and send it back. In case of money bill, they could send it back, but thereafter, after 15 days, automatically it would become law, but non-money bills could be sent back. Now, framers of our constitution never envisaged a situation where members of the Rajya Sabha would neither debate, nor discuss, or vote, but walk into the well of the House day after day, disrupting the proceedings of the House. Now, that is not acceptable. And obviously, some way out has to be found out of this situation.
So let me put this to you then. The Salisbury Convention is possibly a way out. I want to explain it again for the audience and then ask you, Naresh Gujral, whether you believe we should have something similar here. In Britain, under the Salisbury Convention, bills which are part of the election manifesto of a government are automatically passed by the upper house, even if the government doesn't have a majority in the upper house. Should that convention apply in India?
I think now, the way our politics has moved, we require some such thing. Rajya Sabha may be able to hold it for a year at the most, but not beyond that. Because if we allow that to happen, then no government of the day can function. Today it is the NDA, tomorrow it could be the UPA, but I think it is high time we all put our heads together. Obviously, a constitutional amendment is not possible given the current structure of the two houses, but some kind of convention is called for.
Mr. Chari, I want to bring you in before I go to the politicians, because you will bring the view of a professional who's been the Lok Sabha Secretary General for a very substantial amount of time. In a situation where you have a majority government in the lower house with a mandate and it has manifesto promises, if it wants to pass a bill that fulfills a manifesto promise but finds that it doesn't have a majority in the upper house, should the British Salisbury Convention apply?
Well, the British Convention, in my view, doesn't apply to our situation.
So it shouldn't apply?
We have a constitution, a written constitution, and the powers of both the houses of parliament have been well defined, and we have procedures which are followed in both houses on all these matters, passing of the bill and raising discussions and
but
a
I
whole
will
lot of
ask you a
things.
specific question. In the situation where a government with a majority in the lower house does not have a majority in the upper, you're saying manifesto promises should not be automatically passed by the upper house?
No, see, because such situations have arisen in the past also, where a party which came to power in the general elections, they got a majority in the Lok Sabha, but they didn't have a majority in the Rajya Sabha. It's not the first time that it is happening. It has happened in a number of times in
And
the
our
past.
constitution means that you have to live with that. You can't circumvent it.
Certainly you have to live with that. But then, you see, there is something called a political management. That is very, very important.
In other words, you have to accommodate your opponents to ensure that you get a majority.
That is the
Sambit
essence of the
Patra,
situation.
what you're hearing from Mr. Achari, who speaks not as a politician but as a professional who's been Secretary General of the Lok Sabha, is that our constitution requires that when you don't have a majority in the Rajya Sabha, even if you have a majority in the Lok Sabha, it's not conventions like the Salisbury Convention you need to push your legislation through. What you need is political management, the ability to accommodate your opponents and win them over. How do you respond to that?
Karan, in fact, I'm the youngest of the panelists today over here, and many are more learned, far more learned, and particularly Mr. Chari, who has more knowledge about the Constitution. But whatever I understand, I would say, and you would agree, that Constitution of the country, the governance of this country means respecting the mandate, the manifesto, and the desire of the people. And if the government of the day, which has an overwhelming majority, cannot respect the desire of the people, cannot respect its own mandate, I believe that is a defeat of the Constitution. And that's the reason as to why, with evolving years of democracy in Britain, Lord Salisbury and thereafter, if I'm right, in 1945, there was a tremendous victory for the Labour Party, and there were only 16 Labour Party members in the House of Lords. So Lord Salisbury and Lord Addition, Lord Salisbury from the Conservatives and Lord Addition from the Labour Party came together and decided that people's desire has to be respected.
Okay.
So if something has been mentioned in the manifesto, then it should not be delayed or defeated by the House of Lords. It should go to the people.
Okay.
Don't you think this is a good proposition? I believe all my elders would agree to this, that people are the one who should be respected.
Pavan Verma, what lies at the heart of the Salisbury Convention in Britain, and also lies at the heart of Arun Jaitley's claim that we should have something similar in India, is the question of mandate. The lower house has a direct mandate, and when an election manifesto of a majority in the lower house is being passed, there is a real national mandate behind that. The upper house in India has at best an indirect mandate. In Britain it has no mandate at all because it's hereditary or by appointment. Do you not feel that the mandate of the upper house is not as good and strong as the mandate of the lower, and therefore when the lower house government has a popular sanction behind it because it won the election, the upper house should concede at least those bills that fit to its election manifesto?
Karan, the Constitution treats both houses of Parliament on a completely equal footing and makes those exceptions which it believes would be a check on the mandate of the directly elected house, namely money bills. As far as the Salisbury Convention is concerned, I believe we are comparing apples and oranges, because ab initio, the upper house in the United Kingdom is very different from the upper house here. The members may not be directly elected, but they are indirectly elected by state assemblies which have populations which make them one of the largest countries, if they were countries by themselves, in the world. So it is not that the Rajya Sabha is not representative. Now what really needs reform, and that is critical, is the manner in which the party which has a majority in the lower house manages Parliament when it may be in a minority in the upper house. That is the area of reform which Mr. Arun Jaitley needs to learn.
That's the point
because
Mr.
the
Charlie
arrogance
made.
with which he has approached the house.
That's not reform, that's the capacity to politically manage opponents and win their support. But that's a different
exactly.
skill. That's
and
not reform, that's a skill of political management. But you're right to point it out, Mr. Chari made that point.
But that is what our Constitution.
Well, let me come back to the need for reform, because that's what I want to talk about, although you're right in pointing out that the counter to reform is better political management, and the Indian Constitution, you could interpret to say, actually calls for, in these difficult situations, political management rather than reform. But Abhishek Singhvi, in Britain, the reforms that Arun Jaitley is suggesting we might want to adopt here go further than just the Salisbury Convention. Britain has also passed 2 parliamentary acts. The first was 1911, which said that the House of Lords cannot delay a bill for more than 2 years, and that means bills that are both part of the election manifesto as well as bills about issues that the government has dreamt up after it got elected. And then in 1949, the second parliamentary act reduced that period from 2 years to just 1 year. And so the position today is that in Britain, the House of Lords cannot delay a bill for more than 1 year, because if it does, that bill is automatically considered passed. Do we need that as a law in our country, Abhishek Singhvi?
Karan, you and I have both been students in that country, and if you read the debates and the controversies before the passage of the Parliament Act of 1911, you will find that the entire focus is based on the nominated and the hereditary character of that house. That's the fundamental, in fact the basic focus was on the hereditary character, and that is why limitations were put. Secondly, and that is completely inapt to apply to India. Secondly, and more importantly, I think the honest, straightforward way is to do it as the British did it with an act of parliament. They have no constitution. In our country with a constitutional amendment. You cannot do it by subterfuge or stealth.
That's what I say.
You cannot use a so-called convention as a substitute for constitutional amendment, and you know that you do not have, as we discussed in the debate just now, a constitutional amendment majority. Therefore, you do all these other things. If you have the consensus, generate it. Generate the consensus and do a constitutional amendment. And that's important, Karan, because as I said, when you start just touching one part of the constitution, the whole structure can't be just changed like that. It's a very integrated structure. You'll have to change 20 provisions if you start touching one part. And the last aspect is that ultimately it is also amounting to throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You are, just consider one example, a telling example, you are now veering round to the view of the land acquisition bill that 90% of the proposals changes by us should have been accepted. Had you done it 6 months ago, a large part of the stalemate would not have arisen. Then you are throwing the baby out by saying, have a convention, have an amendment. We will not change. We will be intransigent. We will be obstinate. We will stick to our intransigence.
That's a fair point.
Change the constitution, or without changing the constitution, import inapplicable doctrines like Salisbury Convention. That's really throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Naresh Gujral, I'm going to go back to this second idea, not the Salisbury Convention, but the second idea that you pass a law that says that the Rajya Sabha cannot hold up any bill for more than a year or more than 2 years, because if it does, the bill is deemed to have been passed anyway. Now, that may work in Britain, because there the upper house is simply a second house. In India, the upper house actually represents the states. And it's quite possible that the lower house may have a government where many states are not represented at all. You know that from the days of the Janata government. South India was not represented in any adequate way in the Janata government at all. You also know that technically, just 6 states can form a government on their own in India. The 6 being UP, Bihar, Maharashtra, Bengal, Andhra and Tamil Nadu. They have 291 on their own, roughly 20 more than needed. So if you now deny the Rajya Sabha the right to sit on a bill for more than a year or 2, you're really damaging the federal principle, aren't you?
I will say something.
Karan, how do you achieve that? Given the fractured relations between the government and the opposition, how do you pass any bill? How do you make any law? If the opposition today holds a gun to the head of the government and says, we will not debate, we will not discuss, we will, till you dismiss certain ministers or chief ministers, we will only stay in the well of the house. How do you pass anything? So I think it's easy said, but some kind of pressure,
can I
and it will only be public pressure and public opinion.
You're saying that the answer to intransigence, you're saying, Naresh Gujral, that the answer to intransigence or the implacability of the opposition is not better political management, as Mr. Chari suggested, not the capacity to reach out and accommodate, as Mr. Pavan Verma suggested, but reform of the way the Rajya Sabha functions at the cost of possibly undermining its federal structure and the fact that it represents the states in a way in which the Lok Sabha doesn't. Do you really mean to go so far, Naresh Gujral?
Well, unfortunately, the way Parliament is being conducted, especially the Rajya Sabha, I'm very sorry to say, some kind of drastic change is required, because if session after session is going to be washed out, and if the government's economic as well as the other agenda is not going to be passed, then no government can function.
You wanted to come in there.
And that is why it calls not only for a debate, as the finance minister said, but also reform.
You wanted to come in there, Mr. Chari, very quickly.
I wanted to say something about the 2 years wait.
Go ahead.
See, why wait for 2 years? Actually, the constitution provides that if the Rajya Sabha doesn't pass the bill
the joint
for
session.
for 6 months, then you can have a joint sitting. The president will
Can I answer that question to you?
That.
I'll tell you, I'll answer that question without actually answering on behalf of Arun Jaitley, but I imagine that's the answer he'd give. The joint session can only work to the government's favor if the government and its allies have such a large majority in the lower house that they have a dominant majority in the joint session. It is possible, if the BJP had come to power with 282 without an NDA around it, that a joint session wouldn't have worked.
Well,
So a joint session isn't a sufficient answer to the
That is for
problem.
them to work out, but the point is that Constitution has shown the way. If
And
the
that
Rajya
is the
Sabha-
only way you're saying.
Yeah, that is the only way.
You're saying you don't need to try and find new answers. The answers are in the Constitution. And at the end of the day,
That is what I meant.
if you don't have a majority, then you need political management,
Yes.
not reform.
Yeah, that was my first point, but this is my second point.
All right, gentlemen, let's take a break at that point. When I come back, I'm going to turn to another form of reform for the Rajya Sabha that's being proposed. This time not by the finance minister, but by a BJD MP, Jay Panda, who will be joining us after the break to put that to my guest himself. He wants to question and change the way Rajya Sabha MPs are appointed. Don't choose them indirectly, he says. The time has come to follow the American Senate and have direct elections for the Rajya Sabha. Join us after the break for the second part of this critical discussion. Welcome back to our special discussion on the Finance Minister's call for a debate on Rajya Sabha reforms. We're now also joined by BJD Lok Sabha MP Jay Panda. Jay Panda, you believe that like the American Senate, the Rajya Sabha in India should be directly and not indirectly elected. That's another reform that I now want to come on and discuss. Why do you believe it's necessary for the Rajya Sabha to be directly elected, and what benefit will that confer?
Precisely because our Rajya Sabha was partly modelled on the US Senate, and they have faced exactly the same problems and fixed it in a certain way. Now, in both the US Senate and the Indian Rajya Sabha, the members are supposed to represent their entire state. And in the US, for the first 130 years of their nation as a republic, they used to have indirect elections just like us, with the Senate members being elected from the state assemblies. Now, essentially, what happened there is exactly what has become here, which is that the upper house members do not actually represent their state. They have become party nominees, because it is proportional representation from the state assembly depending on the party strength. Once you get nominated by the party, it's a fait accompli. So they are not doing the constitutional duty which they are supposed to do, which is to represent their state and not represent their party views. And for that purpose, a general election, a direct election for the Rajya Sabha would ensure that Rajya Sabha members have to represent the broadest possible views of their state and not be just dictated to by their party whips, which is another reform that is required, because the party whip has completely taken out the concept of MPs, Rajya Sabha MPs representing the state.
Now, Rich Gujral, there are two arguments put forward there by Jay Panda for directly electing Rajya Sabha MPs. Let me put the first to you. He believes that this is the only way of ensuring that Rajya Sabha MPs actually represent the state that they are elected from, rather than their party bosses or the narrow viewpoint of their party. That this is the best way of fulfilling the state mandate that the Rajya Sabha is supposed to have. How do you respond to that argument?
Well, first of all, even in the American Senate, a senator may be representing a state, but he certainly votes along, most of the time, along party lines. And that is exactly what we do in the Rajya Sabha. But coming to the main issue, the moment a Rajya Sabha member of parliament is going to be elected, then like the American Senate, he would be more powerful than even the Lok Sabha member. You would appreciate that the powers of the Senate in the United States are far more than the Congress. So in that case, this requires a huge constitutional change, which I don't think is feasible today.
Now, Pavan Verma, the second argument put forward by Jay Panda for directly electing Rajya Sabha MPs rather than indirectly electing them is that that would be the way of breaking the capacity of party leaders to use their state legislature members to push through people of their choice and preference. A direct election would mean the winning candidate has to be a man of popular support rather than a man with simple loyalty to party leaders. It would break the hold of party leaders on Rajya Sabha MPs. A, do you agree? And B, do you think that's a good reason for reform?
I must confess I don't agree. I appreciate Jay's attempts to think of reform. Democracies must evolve, and new ideas are always welcome, and I'll tell you why I don't agree. You see, firstly, Naresh pointed out one of the reasons, that even if people were to stand from the state, they would become party nominees supported by their parties. So the person who wins on behalf of a direct election would still be in some manner or the other organically linked to a party and would therefore follow that writ to some extent. And that is actually what happens even in the US Senate. So it doesn't solve that problem. Secondly, whether direct elections make people more responsible and less partisan legislators, I don't think it's proven. Today, the Lok Sabha, where the current party or other parties have had a majority, each member follows the party whip on issues without necessary application of mind.
Okay.
And therefore, the fact that they are directly elected does not make them that much either autonomous, independent or wiser, except in following the herd principle of what their party is pushing.
Okay.
There can be internal discussions, but so I don't believe it solves the problem. It's like the suggestion to have a presidential form of government. Not enough thought is given to it,
Okay.
but it's an area of reform that often crops up.
Okay. Now, I want to put to you, Mr. Chari, the concern that Naresh Gujral brought up. He pointed out that if Rajya Sabha MPs are directly elected, they would represent the entire state and not just a constituency within it. Lok Sabha MPs only represent their constituency. So if you have directly elected Rajya Sabha MPs representing an entire state, won't they become people with a bigger mandate than Lok Sabha MPs, and therefore wouldn't that unbalance the balance between the two houses? You'd suddenly have Rajya Sabha MPs with a bigger mandate than individual Lok Sabha MPs.
See, the symmetry that is there in the constitution, structure that we have, that is something which has been arrived at after a lot of deliberations by wise men. The point is, if you are going to have a directly elected Rajya Sabha, then why should we have a Rajya Sabha at all? If it is a directly elected house, why should we have that house? There is already Lok Sabha which is directly elected.
The Americans have two houses, both directly elected.
Well, the point is, when Rajya Sabha was created, and the powers and functions of Rajya Sabha have been laid down in the constitution. Now, they had a certain idea about the constitutional structure that we should have in our country.
You're saying don't tinker and change it.
Yeah, we have a federal structure with certain unitary features, and Rajya Sabha basically represents that federal structure in our country.
But would a direct election damage that? That's the question.
No, direct election, and then.
But answer that, sir, because we're running out of time. Would a direct election damage the federal structure?
Well, direct election, I won't be able to say whether it damages, but I won't put it like that. But the point is, the symmetry that is there in the constitution will be disturbed if we do that.
And that would be to the detriment of the constitution?
Yes, certainly, as it is.
You would also say there'd be no gain in the way that Jayapanda claims there would be a gain?
I don't think we will have any kind of gain, any perceptible kind of gain by doing that.
Abhishek Singhvi, the criticism of Rajya Sabha MPs today is that they are indirectly elected and therefore they are not fully representative of the people. And secondly, they are often creatures of party bosses rather than their own masters. On the other hand, if Rajya Sabha MPs are directly elected, you could argue that they could end up with a bigger mandate than, say, Lok Sabha MPs, and therefore they become more powerful, and secondly, that could change the balance between the two houses. Would you accept that this is not an easy circle to square, if I can put it like that?
While I always appreciate Jayapanda as a man brimming with ideas, he's always got new good ideas, I think unfortunately this would not only drive a coach and four through our constitutional structure, but actually would amount to fixing a square peg in a round hole. You see, the Senate, which elects directly, is premised upon a presidential veto. Senators and even congressmen are very different than MPs because of the presidential veto. The countervailing power in a presidential system is a presidential veto. In a parliamentary democracy, which is what we are, the party whip or the party grouping must prevail. Otherwise, you must change. Now, a senator can initiate legislation himself. He can start the legislation. He can propose, move a bill. MPs cannot. The whole structure is different. And if both houses pass it, the president can veto it. Now, this structure is radically different from what we have, which is a parliamentary democracy where the Prime Minister is a subset of the legislature belonging to the party in power. The President Obama need not belong to the party in power at all. He may have nothing to do with the party in power. The Democrats may be in a minority or a majority. So you are really putting round pegs in square holes and square pegs in round holes, completely different structures. Either you have a Constitutional Review Commission and do the whole kind of a new Constituent Assembly. Otherwise, you will be doing great disservice, because tinkering with parts of the Constitution is a recipe for disaster. Each is so integrated that in this particular example, you require actually 100 articles to be changed, apart from the structure to be changed. And of course, there is always the omnipresent, omniscient basic structure argument, whether we will pass that, because you cannot transplant a US presidential system into a Indian parliamentary democracy, which are two totally different models.
Absolutely, I accept your point, except that to conclude by saying that Jay Panda was trying to transplant a US presidential system on an Indian parliamentary model would be a bit of an unfair exaggeration. He's simply talking about changing the manner in which Rajya Sabha MPs are chosen. But I accept your bigger point. Sambit Patra, where does the BJP stand on this issue? I should point out for the audience that Arun Jaitley has never and probably does not believe you need to change the way Rajya Sabha MPs are chosen. But would you as a party extend your debate about reforms of the Rajya Sabha to include the way Rajya Sabha MPs are chosen?
As far as what Mr. Bajant Panda was proposing, with all due regards to Mr. Panda, he's a very wise man. But on this, if we accept what he has said, it would be just opposite to the logic of Mr. Arun Jaitley. In fact, the end result would be a more powerful Rajya Sabha than a Lok Sabha, in the sense that it's not that the people who would be elected from constituency. They would be representing the whole state. So as most of the able guests over here in the panel have said, that would be a very powerful Rajya Sabha. So the premise on which we are facing a discussion on Lok Sabha, which has a particular government, a particular mandate, that should reflect to Rajya Sabha. That will not happen if this is accepted. So at the end, I would say the basic thing that I believe I want to convey to the people through your program is people's mandate has to be respected. And what Mr. Chari was saying, that wise men have deliberated 2 years to bring in what the Constitution is, to which I would say there are amendments then.
Well, just
no one is questioning
wise
their
men
wisdom.
are
There
not finite in number. They occur generation after generation, and surely later generations have a right. Very quickly, Pavan Verma, because I'm out of time. In 10 seconds only. Go ahead, Pavan Verma.
10 seconds. I think what Mr. Sambit Patra has let on is that what the BJP wants is an emasculated upper house which endorses automatically the tyranny of the majority of the Lok Sabha.
But the problem, Pavan Verma, and this is why I'm interrupting you, is that on this particular point about how Rajya Sabha MPs are chosen, you and Sambit are on the same side. Both of you are opposed to Jay Panda. So let's leave that out. You're playing party politics with each other, but you're both on the same side. You're both opposed to Jay Panda. Jay Panda, I'm going to give the last word to Jay Panda because this was his proposal. He's the only one making it. And I want to put to you, Jay Panda, the key concern that's been echoed by probably everyone, that if Rajya Sabha MPs are directly elected, they could end up becoming more powerful than Lok Sabha MPs, because they could then claim to have a bigger mandate and claim to be more representative of the people than any single lower house MP. And that would unbalance our federal structure and unbalance the relationship between the two houses. How do you respond to that?
No, they would not be more powerful than Lok Sabha MPs. They would be better able to implement their own constitutional mandate, which is to represent the entire state. Even today, the constitution mandates that the Rajya Sabha MPs are supposed to represent the entire state, but since they are not elected from the public, they go by a party whip rather than representing the entire state. Please remember, I am not proposing any other constitutional change. The Lok Sabha would still have the ability to decide solely on money bills, and the Rajya Sabha MPs would be more representative in implementing what the Constitution actually stipulates them to do.
All right, Jay Panda, this is clearly an idea that hasn't got great approval on this panel, but it's an idea that is interesting and it may well appeal to the people of India. And it certainly is an idea that needs to be discussed along with Arun Jaitley's proposals that we need to put some sort of curb on the capacity of the Rajya Sabha as the upper house to hold up legislation passed by the lower house. My thanks to all my guests for joining me. And if you have been, thanks for watching. Goodbye. Good night.